This is Not Your Father's Fundraising Podcast, a podcast about, you guessed it, nonprofit fundraising. This isn't the first podcast about it, but definitely not like any others you've listened to. This is a podcast for fundraisers, by fundraisers. No boring charts or the same stale best practices you've heard for years. No ideas that only work in theory here. No concepts from people who aren't in the same trenches as you are every single day. Each week, you'll get practical strategies and tips to craft messages that engage donors and raise more money. This isn't smoke and mirrors. Everything has been pressure tested in the real world. Plus, you can start using them as soon as the episode ends. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Thomas and Steve Thomas.
Hello, and welcome to episode 23 of Not Your Father's Fundraising Podcast.
The Michael Jordan episode.
The Michael Jordan. This is the last dance. This is the last dance right here. It's actually titled, How You Should Be Using Your Data. Mm-hmm. Data is important, fun, and can be boring if you don't know any better. So we structure it where you not only know better, but we have a special guest.
Our first guest.
Our first guest.
Yeah.
Pretty excited. But we'll get to that when it's time.
Stand by.
Yeah, stand by. I'm your host, Ryan Thomas, Vice President at Oneicity.
And I'm Steve Thomas, CEO and one of the founding partners of Oneicity.
We started this podcast because you know that this work doesn't stay at the office. It is here, and it is 8 to 5. It is 5 to then 8. It's 24 hours a day. It's 7 days a week. It's all the time. And we were talking fundraising and living that life in places where we really shouldn't be talking fundraising, and people were getting bored, and we didn't quite lose friends over it, but maybe. And we realized we should just start a podcast to record these conversations.
Yeah, lose friends on the internet.
Yeah, it's easier to lose friends on the internet I don't have than it is to lose friends I do have, and I don't get invited to people's barbecues and hangouts anymore. So you get to join us here, and you can't really uninvite us because we're not really in person. Oneicity is a small boutique ad agency, and we are focused on marketing and fundraising for nonprofits. That's what gets us out of bed. And we've been around for well more than a decade, and a lot of our team measures our time in the business in decades, plural. And we have an awesome team that keeps us on track, especially at this time of year, heading into fourth quarter. If you have any questions or comments, we prefer awesome comments, but we will take constructive criticism as long as it's actually constructive.
The therapy's working. We're all right.
Yeah, we're getting there. Good. And send all that to podcast@oneicity.com and give us your 5-star reviews, 4-star, or 3.5. Yeah. Fine. Give that to us on Apple, Google, Spotify, wherever you're getting your podcast. Just hit the number of stars and give us a review. We'd love to know what you think.
Yep.
So our first segment is always something that we've seen in the wild. It's mail call. This is fundraising we've run into or marketing we've run into that we want to relate to our audience. So I'll let you go first.
Okay. One of the things that happened last week was we brought in a couple of our team, and because they're in the Pacific Northwest, and
flew them in for a second. I was like, I thought this week was our first guest episode.
One guest, yeah, sorry,
audience behind us,
and so as we're in Texas currently, we wanted to work face to face for a while, and so they came in and. That was so much fun because it is exactly like, in many ways, like this podcast of a bunch of people working around the table and moving off in ones and twos and then coming back and gathering. And one of the things that came out of that was a piece of mail that somebody had received, and wanted to just throw that into kind of the conversation that we were doing on some planning. And it's interesting. This is, if you're on video, you probably can recognize this is a credit card offer from somebody. It doesn't matter who. But one of our team was talking about the feel of the paper, because it has it has a different feel than anything else that's going to be in your mailbox that day. And we talked about the differences between paper perceptions, how certainly color impacts and what's written on it, but there's a tactile, there is a sensory input that comes with paper, and this paper probably feels more expensive than you want to send to just all your donors. But to some donors, it's going to feel like what they want to feel.
It's going to feel special.
Yeah. So none of this is in the wild. I just want to say the lesson here is consider what the paper feels like. And if you're an organization that needs to really appear thrifty and someone who didn't spend much money on what they're doing for fundraising, that's part of maybe your ethos or part of what you believe your donors believe, that you don't want to use paper like this, but you may want to use a paper that looks really good but has a more, let's call it, textured feel
a different the feel, I think, is important, and less what that feel is, and more that it feels different than the other bills and other things they're getting.
So just don't ignore that as you're considering an impact. Consider what the paper will actually feel like in your donor's hand.
It's not just what goes on the OE, it's what is in the OE.
Yeah.
All right, so mine's also OE related as I dig down.
Oh, and you brought your homework.
Finally.
Two podcasts.
I kind of have to hide it because it's a client.
Yeah.
But this is an OE with lots of information on the front and the back, and it's for a Thanksgiving impact, and it says that there's a Thanksgiving placemat on the inside. There are meal tickets as well. It's got a facsimile.
It's a rescue mission client.
Correct.
Go ahead and say that. Yeah.
And on the back, it talks about the things, the things we need, the things the client needs, and talks about the meal, how much the meal costs, and when you got to send it back, and that, we're not going to be able to serve the meals without it. Basically, the point is a donor gets everything they absolutely need just from looking at the envelope. And now, not everything we would put into it, but the bare minimums, the scaffolding, is present on the outer envelope. And that's important for lots of reasons. One of them is that if you think about a donor or somebody making a mail decision, usually it's over a trash can.
Yeah.
As you get your mail, you're coming in from the mailbox. I usually come in through my garage, so I pass a trash can. And if I've gotten through sorting, I can toss everything in before I get into the house. If your messaging isn't just who you are on the outside and actually gets into your message about this impact and your ask and the rest of your scaffolding, you're able to make a case even as they're throwing it away. And that may not get them to stop throwing it away and give a gift. But if you're doing that in a series, that touch point might have a little lasting impact than if they just throw it away. So maybe the impact in 2 weeks or 2 months tips them over the edge to give a gift.
All right. I love that because that fits into a couple of podcasts back. We talked about that the service the UPS does where they show you in an email what's coming in your mail,
the picture,
the advanced delivery stuff, and so they get a picture of it there. You talked a couple of weeks ago on the podcast about the need for multiple repetition of the call to action, and so before they open that envelope, they've had their first call to action from the organization. And so I love that strategy. It's beautiful to watch that work. It doesn't work just for rescue mission type clients. You can play that game with a variety of pieces, and they all have a different look and feel, and you have opportunities.
Yeah, and the way, if you're interested in trying it and it doesn't apply, is I would, after you've written your appeal, write your scaffolding out, and then start by just putting your scaffolding sentences on there and flesh it out into more copy language, and then you'll have what you need.
Yeah, and you may be in a situation where, our branding guidelines don't allow us to do things like that. Yeah. So, if you can't get over that, again, there are still ways to go about that. If nothing else, you can kick them to a landing page, particularly if you have a URL or a way to direct them in an easy to remember phrase that they can go. Yeah, let me look at what that looked
Let's
at.
see what
Yeah.
that is.
All right. Good. Okay.
Next is something you should be doing if you're not already. You should try this right now, except wait till the episode's over.
Yeah.
So not really right now.
Yeah.
So what's yours? What's your try first?
As happens, I read something. It sent me down the path because I thought I've always heard that, but I didn't know if it was true. So we've discussed spending more time on teasers and headlines and subject lines, and I ran across an article where someone was talking about the 80-20 headline rule, where 80% of the people will read your headline, only 20% of the people will read your body copy or read the rest of the piece. And I was like, I don't know if that's a real rule or not. I mean, you can it's almost safe to do 80-20 with anything.
Yeah.
But
There's like 4 80-20 rules, I think.
Yeah, well, and only 80% of those rules are true. Anyway,
Yeah, the other 20%.
So turns out David Ogilvy, which is he's one of the pioneers in the good old days of advertising. Had
The OG, you might say.
Yeah, he is the OG. He says on average 5 times as many people read the headline as read the body copy. When you've written your headline, you've spent 80 cents of your dollar. And that's again, he doesn't actually cite any sources. He's a big enough guy in those days.
He's his own source.
He can just say it. He's his own source. And I'll just be like him and say that's true. What I would like you to try to do is, as you go into, because you probably aren't tracking time, you aren't paying attention to that, but if you're writing, or if you're someone who's reviewing someone else's writing, first let's do the writing. If you're writing, every subject line, make sure you have 5 options. Just do 5 subject lines. Every time you get to a headline, make sure you've thought of 5 headlines. Every time if you do teasers on your envelopes that you mail or anything like that, make sure you got 5 of those. That will help you begin to think about where you should put your energy and effort and where the most magic is. Because if your headline's bad, they never make it to the body copy. But if your body copy is not exactly sparkling, if your headline sparkles, you can still get them into the body copy. So right now, don't worry about how much time you spend or how many dollars you spend on it. Just make sure you've got 4, 5 options for each thing you do.
Handful,
and then
least.
Notice how the 3rd or 4th one will often be the one that has the most energy.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So try that.
You might say the headline does 80% of the work.
Yeah, I like that. If you were just a big enough source, you could just
I could just cite myself.
Ryan Thomas says,
I'm not that big. Mine is you should audit your photos. And in your
okay,
just using the A word can
fun.
bring some people.
Yeah, get a little twitch.
And not necessarily your photo library. Don't go through those, because almost every photo you have in your library or bank or whatever will work in the right setting.
Right.
But almost do a separate review or a separate look when you're reviewing emails or whatever this fundraising piece is. Go back through and look at the photos after you look at the words.
The photos you're using.
Yeah, the photo you're using. Because you can have unintentionally, if you're just looking at the flow, you can end up like, that photo's not horrible. Your brain says, I remember that photo. I know that guy. And you go through, it all works. But if you don't go through and let's look at just the photo on this pass, you could easily end up with a photo that doesn't match your topic. And if you are asking for meals, you're asking for sloths, you could end up with a photo of someone who either isn't eating, is doing something else, or another animal instead of a sloth, or a sloth that's playing on something.
It was anteater slipped.
Yeah. And so just go back through and make sure you have a photo that matches what you're talking about. And no donor will say, I was going to give to that, but that photo didn't really make sense, so I didn't. but subtly in the back of their brain, it's not really the back, but in the part of their brain where they're making decisions and thinking fast, that will cause a little bit of dissonance, and that will guide them
Turns
to
into
the path you don't want to go.
a bad speed bump kind
Yep.
of a thing. Yeah. And that happens when you have been talking about need and then you got a big smiley picture or vice versa.
Yep.
You get that dissonance, and it's just enough to make a donor go, I'm not
And
tracking
even they
with
don't
you.
know.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
that guy up there who's working the levers. He's like, I don't know.
Their
that makes
brain.
sense.
Oh, that's good. Ogilvy turned out a bunch of that kind of stuff out there.
That's good.
Okay.
Awesome.
Cool.
So next, we're gonna magically transport into a 3-person setup, and we're gonna be joined by a special guest.
Who's our special guest?
Well, they'll have to find out in like
Okay.
30 seconds.
Okay.
So we're gonna transition to that, and then we're gonna talk data, a ton of data, and
And it's less boring than you think it's going to be.
I'll even go so far as to say it's actually fun.
Yeah. All right. I had a good time.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, okay.
So we're gonna hop into that, and then we're gonna hop out. It's data time. This is our first pre-recorded segment, and we're talking data. There's no data pun that goes with a pre-recorded segment, but we'd find it if there was one. We're here with Kris Hoots, president, founder of Oneicity, and leading number one, which had a startup. If Google was going to acquire us, that would be a huge deal because the payout would be massive.
Google, you know how to find me.
Yeah, because we're on YouTube.
Yeah.
Literally, you know how to find us.
Yeah, we're right there.
And you're a huge part of the company. You're not only in charge of leading data strategy, you lead client strategy, you lead client, you have relationships with clients, you do massive things, but data is one of your expertises. But the main reason you're not on every week is because you're a little more on the rails than this podcast ever really is.
Button down. Yeah.
The only time we're buttoned down is if we're wearing Oxford shirts.
Which we haven't done yet.
No, we haven't done
In
that.
fact, you're the dressiest guest we've ever had on our show.
I'm the
By
only
far.
guest you've ever had.
Okay, that's a
Well,
technicality.
it's not funny if you say it that way.
Yeah. Okay.
So, data's your thing, even to the point where you have a famous or infamous presentation out on the internet from 2010,
Yeah.
which not the earliest days of the internet, but the internet's still early days, and it's titled I Heart Data. So let's just start with the basics. What is data?
All right. I think I can handle that.
I hope so. We're throwing low balls. Just wait till we start taking listener calls.
Oh dear. So data, not just numbers. It's facts and statistics and other information, and it helps nonprofits tell stories. It builds relationships.
I love that you, and I know this is not what I'm supposed to be saying, but I love that you equate data with storytelling.
It is.
That's beautiful.
It's the truth.
Yeah.
Hashtag
It's the truth.
truth.
Hashtag truth.
So it's the kinds of things that comprise data are things like names and addresses, but it's also statistics like largest gift ever given, or total ever given, or average, or the first time you ever gave a gift.
So I can have a data point, which is a dollar amount, but my data is also what that data point means. So my $25 that I give, that's a data point, but you can also find ways to make that $25 tell a story if it's my
Sure.
first gift or if
Sure.
it's my most recent gift.
Sure, that's absolutely correct. You could use it to inform your strategies using things like, let's see. You said it's a data point, and yes, it's a data point, and that each transaction represents an ability to take action.
Oh,
Okay. And it represents a donor decision.
Correct.
And a donor's involvement with the organization in some way, that the dollars can become the focus, but it's the donor behavior.
Sure, it's going to tell us their motivation. It does not tell us their philanthropic intent,
Okay.
which is something for you for another time.
Okay, all right.
But
is that in another column?
But it does, it can reveal what motivated them to give the gift. And it also tells how they want you to spend the money.
Okay, I know what question you were getting ready to ask. I was getting ready to ask the same
How
one.
does that tell us what motivated me to? All you know is that I gave you $25 on Thursday.
Well,
that doesn't
sure,
tell you anything else.
but maybe I went online in response to your e-newsletter, and I clicked the Give Now button, and so something about that e-newsletter caused me to give a gift. Or maybe I received a letter from the president of your nonprofit, and I'm asking for urgent funds for, say, a hurricane that just
rolled
happened.
through New Orleans?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and so I have an opportunity to engage with that ask from the president, and so my motivation is to help people who are affected by a hurricane, and then I want you to spend the money helping people who are affected by a hurricane.
So because I gave a $25 gift on Thursday, either a dedicated page, there are a few ways, but we can reasonably infer that was because of the hurricane letter or message. Mm-hmm. So that tells you I am passionate about the disaster recovery or disaster relief arm of your organization. So now not only do you know my level of giving, but you know something more about me and could maybe use that in later messaging to target me.
Oh, sure. The next time there's a hurricane, then I could send you a letter saying as someone who has responded in situations like this before, would you consider making an urgent gift in response to this request or something like that? Copywriting, not my thing.
Yeah.
Data, my thing.
Well, we're recording, so we could just take that and transcribe it. Anybody, if you need if you need a hurricane recovery appeal, we got it ready.
Right.
So why do you? I guess first I should say, is the title of your presentation true from 2010? It says you heart data. Do you actually heart data, or is it just something no one else in the company can do and you get stuck with it?
And on the podcast, we've agreed we might exaggerate, but we never lie.
Oops.
I heart data. I love data because I find humans confusing and data makes sense.
Present company excluded.
I don't know about that. Many humans are confusing, but many humans find data confusing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's because most humans are gray. They're on the continuum.
Okay, was that an old comment?
I mean, I know one person on the podcast who is. So what do you mean by people are gray?
Yeah.
Well, they're not black and white. And the data that
And how they think.
engage with is black and white. It's I always say it's colorblind. And some smarty pants out there is going to say that, well, my database can read color and all of that. But the data that I'm engaging with is colorblind. It's either a 1 or a 0, an on or an off, a yes or a no, a true or a false. And humans are a bunch of maybe.
Yeah. Okay, that kind of gets both of us in that one.
A big bunch of maybe.
It's a little too close to home.
So that's why I love it.
All right, so if you love it, obviously, as much as we enjoy our 3-person podcast, Complete Audience, all right here, at least our theoretical intended audience are nonprofit executives and fundraisers and the range of people that appears are listening to the podcast are everyone from very small startup kinds of organizations up to maybe, if we're inferring correctly, some larger organizations. So why should that group of people, these leaders and fundraisers, why? Because I know you're a data evangelist. Why should they love data too?
because they want to do more of what works and less of what doesn't. So
Agreed. Okay.
From the small to the large nonprofit, they want to take action on things that were successful or learn from things that weren't successful, and refine and adjust strategies around what the data says.
And so what kinds of evaluative information could you,
I don't know if that's a word.
It is evaluative. Isn't that a word?
It's a word.
2 out of 3. You got voted off. Anyway, now I lost my train of thought. Oh, so what kinds of evaluations could you make from data to help? And maybe because this is what you do all day long, so maybe it's even something that you've recently been involved in or you're getting ready to do. What kinds of evaluations can you help an executive or a fundraiser make strictly out of data?
Well, if I am fundraising for sloths, I hear we do a lot of that.
The sloths are just
on the podcast.
And great.
We do.
So I'm fundraising for sloths, and I send out my year-end letter, and I get $1 million.
Everybody loves a sloth.
Bum, 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 bum.
Because the consequences were clearly stated.
That's right.
And
there was a deadline.
I also know that it cost me $900,000 to get that $1 million. It's very expensive.
Holy cow!
I mean, I know we do a great job for the sloth. Apparently, we're using the best paper.
No, we mailed the whole country.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. A little carpet bombing kind of thing going on there.
Blitz,
Yeah.
right,
Okay. All right.
A postal blitz. No. Seriously. So we would be able to capture both income and expenses and evaluate how what the ROI is, the profit, if you will, on a mailing. If we don't capture both of those numbers accurately, then we might just have this $1 million piece and decide we're doing well based on.
Yeah. So you end up with this big gross number, and then you got your net coming out of that. You know, which is on your thing is a significantly smaller number. But talk about how you can filter that granularly. Because I know.
Well, sure. We can look at that whole $1 million and find out that most of it came from 2 large gifts or something.
Okay.
And so if we toss out the large gifts, then we find out that we're really upside down.
Okay.
Meaning it actually did really, really poorly, and we paid money.
Right.
And we didn't realize how badly we did until
It turns
Until
out
it's too
maybe
late.
sloths aren't such a great offer.
No, slots are
No,
awesome.
they're great. We just didn't raise for the right enclosure.
Okay.
But so that's really interesting because that's a quote unquote real life example of an appeal. I did the sloth appeal. We got $1 million in. We know we spent $900,000. It was from 2 big gifts, a lot of it. What are some other things we could look at to say, okay, at the end of the year, we've got to keep talking sloths. What could we do differently from a data perspective, like less people, more people, different people?
Sure. Well, maybe we didn't mail enough, which is
Holy cow, you're spending money like crazy already.
no. We went to people who don't know us, and maybe we didn't mail enough people who do know us
And what's that called?
on the database.
A mistake.
No, I mean like you're segmenting, right?
Oh, sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Sure. And I'm using and so by mailing to people who don't know about us, I didn't create a compelling enough offer. I hope you've gone over offer.
We've talked a little bit about
A
that.
little bit.
We're waiting to get you back in to do an offer tune-up.
And so it wasn't tangible enough. It wasn't accessible enough for people who didn't know about us. But we got those big gifts from people who did know us.
Okay.
So we need to find more of those people in the data that we have,
Right? Where would you look for them?
in the database.
Well, but I mean, like, you look for
Open up the server.
Yeah,
And just
like,
look inside.
it's a bunch of wires.
Hello.
Well, what kinds of things do you look? So that gets it back into patterns of history and giving. And
Well, sure. I've seen it multiple times where at a year-end piece in particular, people get some ideas that we want to suppress or exclude people who have recently made gifts.
Those people aren't in this room at the moment. These are other people who would suppress and not.
Correct, not us.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
But no, I've seen it over the years. I've encountered it in other nonprofits situations where there's some idea to, somebody like a leader might get it in their mind's eye that there's too much mail.
Yeah.
And so they decide on behalf of their database, there's too much mail. And so they choose to mail less and instead go to people who don't know them.
Like in your previous example.
Exactly.
How we messed up. Yeah.
So that's about,
Okay.
I think that's about it.
Okay.
Until we do a deeper dive.
Yeah.
Because sadly, my head's not quite swimming, but pretty close. And this is your entry level. So
I know I haven't
It's a
stuck
lot
to
of fun.
entry level.
Yeah. Okay. So.
no, it's great.
All right. So, one of the commitments is that we're going to do practical kinds of things. So let's assume we've got two groups listening, a big bucket of smaller organizations and some of bigger organizations. Okay. So, what's a recommendation you have for a smaller organization? And again, because I'm not the ones and zero, I'm the gray guy. Define small however you want to, but just kind of the smaller end of the scale. What data recommendations from your experience and what you see would you make for them?
I both recommendations for both small and large start with the same thing.
Okay, great.
Don't get suckered in by the fancy sales presentation.
Of
who's selling?
No,
okay.
That's a dot.
Okay.
For small organizations, it's the fancy sales presentation of a donor database. It's be true to the system you have, which might even be Microsoft Excel or some other spreadsheet software, and keep your data there as pure and clean as you can. And instead of getting suckered into the big fancy, I won't name names, fancy salesman showing you all the things that another
My app might
Look at what it can do.
yeah ABC database could do.
Yeah.
And apologies if there's an ABC database out there.
They're probably somewhere, but they're on their own.
I have seen that happen more than once, where a nonprofit invests tens of thousands of dollars that they really didn't have to spend on a fancy database when they could have done just as well with a database that's either in a spreadsheet or a very simple database, because keeping it simple for small organizations is a very valuable effort.
Because you got to be able to execute, right?
You have to be able to use. You have to be able to use it, and you 9 times out of 10 get sold something that you can use just a tiny percentage of.
Yeah.
So that's with small. With big, same. Don't get suckered into the fancy presentation, but this time it is. Hey, here's a fancy database where you can store your volunteer information, and here's a fancy database where you can store your email addresses. And what happens is you end up with siloed data. So
What does siloed data mean?
There you go.
it means
For
that
people like me.
that it means that I have one main database, which is the names and addresses and gift information donation information we talked about. And then we have, in a separate database that doesn't communicate to the other one, we have volunteer information, or we have email information, and they're not communicated. They're in silos. Think farm. Think silos.
We're big in the Midwest.
Yeah, and we believe really strongly that the more integrated your data can be, that you have one instance of a donor and all the information about a donor, one instance of a volunteer and all the information about a volunteer, all in the same database, because then you can use all the communication strategies across audiences, another word.
Ooh.
Donors, volunteers, people who donate goods, people who are interested in being on your newsletter, your prayer team, a variety of audiences. And then there are, of course, within those things like major donors or monthly donors. And so having everybody in one main database instead of separated out is really important. If you, as a large organization, have to separate out, then having some sort of a key or a call back to the main database where there's regular syncing up of data.
So they're siloed still, but they talk.
But they communicate.
Okay, so you and I share work on a client. One of the clients we work on together has their primary database. And then because they really liked the way another database worked with their volunteers, they did that. And those two databases were supposed to talk to each other. But what happened?
So the salesman said,
Well, now they're undoing that.
Yeah.
They're moving the volunteer information back into the main database because they were recognizing that they have people who are in the database who have multiple roles. I'm a donor and a volunteer, and I donate goods to your thrift store. And if I have a thrift store database and a volunteer database and a regular database for donations, and I want to talk to somebody like I know who they are, well, then I better have all that data about them in one place.
no.
And that sync, in theory, worked great. In practice, it left unsubscribes on the table. It didn't keep up with bounces.
And then I'm not talking to somebody like I know who they are.
Exactly.
And maybe even worse, you are talking to them like you know them, but you actually don't.
But you're wrong.
Correct.
You're telling somebody who has never volunteered for you, thank you for volunteering with us, and then that's clear you don't really pay attention to me, and that's a bad interaction.
Right, or I'm trying to recruit volunteers for a large event, and I am talking to the donor database without knowing who the volunteers are in that donor database. So there are a lot of words in data that are a lot of terms. And I remember coming into this business and learning that it took a year to learn all of the various terms and seasons and
The rhythms of a
of a nonprofit. And so if there are terms here that we're saying that don't make sense, well, let's ask.
Yeah. Email podcast@oneicity.com.
Attention Hoots.
Or just, I'll see that it's got data in it, and I'll just forward it.
Okay, so I really appreciate you being willing to step in and appear on the podcast because I know this is not your favorite thing to do.
No.
Okay. And so what we're going to do is make sure this is a good experience. We have parting gifts for you. Yeah, in the green room.
Yeah.
And all those things is you're coming back to talk about
Structuring an offer.
Structuring an offer and audiences. I think we need to deal with that.
Okay.
Are you game to do that? Okay, good.
Well, we got it on tape, so now you can't back out.
And our vast audience,
Well, they'll be let down.
it'll be sad. Okay.
Seriously. Thank you for joining. And if you're listening, we're going to do an awkward and bad segue in a separate
it's gonna be
recording
awesome.
into whatever's next.
I'm doing a good one. You do what you want to do, but I'm doing a good
I don't even
segue.
know what's next.
Okay,
So
it'll be
it doesn't
great.
matter.
On your radar, probably.
It should be on my radar, but it's not.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you.
So
She seemed to mostly have a good time.
she mostly had a good time.
Yeah.
And I didn't in all that time of it playing, I didn't have a good segue. So my promise on an awkward segue back into what we're
Yeah,
doing.
you did that. Good.
It's paid off.
Delivered. That was excellent.
We're big on backing up what we say we're going to do.
Yeah.
So last is on your radar. And this is something that started, you and I just passed things back and forth. And hey, you don't have to read this right now, but it ought to be on your radar. Sometimes it's fundraising related. Sometimes it's cars that go fast and it just becomes a part of your life. I made you go first and everything else.
Yeah.
Go first on this.
Oh, man. I'm just leading the way.
Yeah, you are.
So I'm really blessed that in the current configuration that we live in, I have an office that is also my gym. Okay. And so the office where I do a lot of the work that doesn't involve anybody else is actually a tiny corner of the gym that I enjoy working out in. And so one of the things
80% gym, 20% office.
Gym, 20% office. And there'd be those who would say the productivity is about the same.
That joke works about 80% of the time.
Yeah, you're still there. So one of the things I have started watching on the treadmill is a Netflix show. No, I beg your pardon, an Amazon show called Iron Cowboy.
Ooh, I've got that in my watch list. I haven't watched it.
I'm not going to tell you how it ends, but I do want to talk about it. So a guy named James Lawrence back in 2015 decided he was going to do 50 Ironman races, which is a bike, swim, run, in 50 states in 50 days. And so, it's quite an endeavor. And part of the goal was to do it, but it was also to raise money.
Okay. I actually didn't know that.
So, a 50-day story short, it was really grueling, very tough. Right in the middle of it, he is in such bad shape. He's taking some IVs. They're just really, again, he's saying it's only fluids. His feet were so beat up and he was in such bad shape physically that his coach recommended he do. There was a hurricane came through, and so they ended up being inside trying to complete the road race and the running part and the bicycle part.
Wow.
Yeah. So they go into a gym, and then his coach says, "Your feet are so beat up. Why don't you do the road race part, the running part on an elliptical?" Well, two things started happening. All of the die-hard Ironmen fundamentalists were like, "You can't take an IV in the middle of an Ironman. That violates all our rules. Who knows what's in that?" And they, on elliptical, you can't do that, even though it's the 37th consecutive Ironman race he's done in 37 days. They got
in 37 states.
So all of that began to kind of take away all of the momentum and initiative and all the things he was trying to do. I won't spoil the story, but he didn't raise the money he had planned to raise. The controversy really, in some people's view and at various points, overshadowed the awareness he was trying to bring to the causes he was trying to lift
that
up.
Sucks.
Yeah. So what I just want to say, when you do something that is not first fundraising. Now, I'm somebody, you and I both do our own versions of endurances and challenges and races. And I just completed one, and there were several people who were doing them for charities and for causes. I just did it for me because I separate the crazy challenges I do and the races I do from the donations I do.
Yeah.
And so you want to be careful, because one of the things that happens is the people who give to these kinds of things are more typically not donors. They're just riding the wave. They are friends and family. They got involved somehow, and so they make a gift that will be really tough to transition. The way it works is in a marathon or a 5K that you do, or a golf tournament, or a variety of things. So have on your radar that people who give to these kinds of things are more often there are acquisition prospects for another gift, not donors yet. And careful about how much time and energy and dollars you spend there, because you could be sadly disappointed, as Kris said in the data segment. The ROI might not be what you really think it is once you dial it down. So nothing against Iron Cowboy. It's an amazing accomplishment. It made me sad that his fundraising goals, because those weren't getting reached, that overshadowed the incredible accomplishment of attempting that. And I can't even
he is
considering
fathom
something even crazier, which I hope he just separates from fundraising and does it through commercial sponsors. So anyway, have on your radar, awareness and fundraising, challenges and races and fundraising are not always the same thing.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Not everybody will agree with that.
Yeah, well, of course
80% of you won't agree with that.
80% of our people. Mine is there was a study that a group did about hit songs going all the way back from, I think, 1955 through 2018, 2019. And they found that through time, so across that spectrum, across that period of time, hit songs used harmonic surprise, which breaking patterns and what you're expecting to hear. And they found that it's happening more often now because people have figured that out. People are maybe more risque in music that they'll make.
Yeah.
But that when you take what people expect to hear in chord progression, or I can't even get into the music of it, but when you take what people expect from that and flip it on its head, but you do it well, so it doesn't become noise, that gets people's attention and they connect with it and they get excited about it. And that applies to you, listener or viewer, in that you should be surprising in your fundraising. You should break patterns. You should break your own patterns. You should break patterns of your attention competitors. But don't go looking to be surprising, because if you go looking to be surprising, people that's the equivalent of a musician just saying, well, I'm going to do everything different.
Yeah. Look for the surprise. Here it comes.
And then all the music sounds like crap because they weren't trying to make good, interesting music. They were trying to do everything different.
Yeah.
So write your fundraising, but every time you're reviewing, or if you've got the time and the process and still a separate time to look at it and say, is there something different we can do here? Can we say this, but can we say it a different way? Or can we start with telling the end of the story first and then work our way back? But do the hard work, the consistent work first, then look for ways to spice it up. And no, you don't have to do it every time. Yeah. And we have people who get caught up in I've got to do all of these tricks and strategies in every single thing. And not 80 or 20, 100% of the time, that's the wrong thing to do, because it will not everything can fit. So be surprising, harmonic surprise, but in print. Or, I don't know, I guess if you do a podcast or something audio, you can use harmonic surprise literally.
Yeah.
Oh gosh.
That was not good.
I thought it was great. It was a good surprise.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, it was very surprising.
It was on brand for this podcast.
That is very true. It's very on brand.
Just saying.
All right. Well, that was episode 23 of Not Your Father's Fundraising Podcast. And on our next episode, we're going to talk about ways to waterproof your mail so that it doesn't get soggy in the mailbox before it gets to donors.
Or when people cry as they read it.
The tears just drip off and slide off, and it's still perfectly preserved when they go to show their neighbor this awesome appeal you wrote them.
I like that.
So stay tuned for that next week. I'm Ryan Thomas.
And I'm still Steve Thomas.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Not Your Father's Fundraising Podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. We really appreciate that effort. Tune back in next week for another fresh episode of Not Your Father's Fundraising Podcast.